So our episode begins with Roose Bolton looking over the carnage of the Red Wedding. Now it should be noted that in the books, Roose Bolton had a separate host from Robb's and did other significant actions to conquer the North. He sent off the non-Bolton northern houses of his host on a useless and devastating campaign to conquer Duskendale. Additionally, he had the non-Bolton forces take up the rear of his fleeing host, and many were stranded behind flooding rivers and slaughtered by the Lannisters. Essentially, he let the other northern houses die while he very carefully kept Bolton men away from harm's way. In fact, he was doing this the whole series. Bolton forces were the last into battle against Tywin, he took Harrenhal using the Brave Companions, he took Moat Cailin via trickery, and even in the Battle of Ice in the book, he sent off the Freys and Manderleys while the Bolton forces stayed inside castle walls. Now here in the show, somehow Grey Wind's head has been put on Robb's body with lightning speed in order for the Hound and Arya to see it. This impossible action is not done in the book. Arya is knocked out by the Hound and actually leaves the Red Wedding unsure of her family's fate. She even wants to head back to the twins, hoping that her family has only been held prisoner. Now, as I said last time, there is something off about sewing an enormous direwolf head on Robb's body. We should remember that Robb is still a boy, and a direwolf is huge. A regular wolf's head may have been used instead. Meanwhile, back in King's Landing, Tyrion and Sansa are having moments of bonding, while Shae looks on jealously. Again, in the book, Shae is never jealous, and Tyrion and Sansa never share any positive moments. On the contrary, Tyrion describes their relationship as beyond cold. Part of this is because Sansa hates Lannisters, but part of it is also that Sansa is secretly scheming to escape King's Landing. She's been regularly meeting with the fool Dantos in the Godswood, and Dantos has been claiming that he can spirit her away. Her nervousness about this plan has made her sheepish at other times. Now next we get a scene that's rather similar to the book where Joffrey is giddy about Robb's death and wants Robb's head sent to King's Landing so he can taunt Sansa with it. This leads to Tyrion telling Joffrey that Sansa is no longer his to torment. Tyrion actually says a line from the book where he threatens Joffrey by saying, "Kings seem to be dying like flies." This actually doesn't make much sense in the show as only Robb has died. In the book, both Balon Greyjoy and Robb die in quick succession, making it a trend. Anyway, as in the book, Tywin actually comes to Tyrion and Sansa's defense, which leads to Joffrey insulting Tywin and Joffrey getting sent to bed. This friction between Tywin and Joffrey actually makes some book readers suspect that Tywin had a hand in Joffrey's murder, or at least knew about it. I don't think there's too much evidence of this, but I do grant you that Joffrey's murder gives Tywin more years of control over Tommen and a more pliable king after that to boot. And I will grant that after Joffrey's death, Tywin knows that Tyrion is not Joffrey's murderer, but he has no interest in finding out who that murderer may be. Then again, he may just assume it's Sansa. Now next we get an extra scene exploring the complicated and often contradictory relationship between Tywin and Tyrion. Here Tywin criticizes Tyrion for caring only for himself and not caring about the family, and Tyrion replies that Tywin is the one who in fact only cares about himself. Tywin counters that he let Tyrion live as an obligation to House Lannister. Really? Because of what we've seen of the cruel, honor-obsessed world of Ice and Fire, he really should have dealt with Tyrion quite differently. Disabled family members like Jingle Bell Frey are kept out of sight, and the idea of mercy-killing Bran came out of the mouth of Robert. And Randall Tarley sent Sam to the wall essentially for being fat. Honor in the corrupt world of Westeros really dictates killing Tyrion or hiding him away. After all, Tyrion is nothing but an embarrassment for House Lannister, and Tywin was supposedly quite affected by his father's weakness and how it brought dishonor on their house. And yet, Tywin keeps Tyrion alive, and even tries to find him suitable marriages, and a lordship with Winterfell. On the other hand, he deprives Tyrion of Casterly Rock. Both book and show really like to keep us guessing about Tywin's feelings about Tyrion. Doing it all for House Lannister is a motive pushed hard in the show, but it doesn't really fit. Tywin's feelings definitely seem to be complicated. I tend to believe that Tywin is more selfish than Lannister-oriented myself, but the family's honor, and yes, even love for his children, certainly play a role in his actions. Next, Tyrion goes to tell Sansa the news about her brother, and finds that she's already been told. In the book, Tyrion actually does break the news to her, and she doesn't cry, until he closes the door, and he hears her sobbing behind it. Next, Bran's posse has made it to the Night Fort, the old abandoned headquarters of the Night's Watch. Again, this castle was abandoned after Queen Alysanne had the headquarters of the Watch moved, along with her other reforms giving the Wall the new gift and ending the practice of the Lord's right to the First Night. Now, I suspect that Alysanne did not like what was going on at the Night Fort. In the past, the Night Fort was used for sacrificing to the others. We know that Craster sacrificed babies to the others, so I do wonder if babies were being offered here as well. So here Hodor is calling into an oddly indoor well that actually goes down to the so-called Black Gate, a secret door through the wall in the shape of a werewood face. Considering that the Night's Watch has regular tunnels through the wall, a secret door would only really be needed if something nefarious was going on, and a god's face eating those that go through it does ring of sacrifice. Anyway, in the book, Bran begins to tell a bunch of stories about the Night Fort. Here in the show, we are treated to one of these stories, that of the Rat Cook. So in the Rat Cook's story, he breaks guest right and kills the Andal King's son and feeds it to the Andal King in a pie. Afterwards, the Rat Cook is transformed into a giant white rat who lurks in the tunnels beneath the Night Fort and cannibalizes his own young. Interestingly, this tale has elements from a couple different George R. Martin stories. One is called Dark Dark Were the Tunnels, set on a post-apocalyptic Earth where a white-skinned subterranean protagonist telepathically uses rats to guide him through the tunnels. The other is called In the House of the Worm, where two post-apocalyptic subterranean human factions cannibalize each other. Perhaps the Rat Cook story is an homage to these stories, or perhaps the Rat Cook story is a loose remembering of human beings being forced underground after a devastating war and descending into cannibalism. I do think it's interesting that the Rat Cook's fate is humanity's fate after, say, a nuclear war. Or if not nuclear war, simply the Long Night. The Night Fort may have been just that, a fort to protect against the Long Night, where people went pale and lived in tunnels like rats and descended into cannibalism. Anyway, next we have an extra scene of exposition between Roose Bolton and Walder Frey. Walder discusses how Hoster Tully calls him the late Walder Frey because he was late to the Trident, fighting for neither Hoster Tully his lord or his king Aerys Targaryen, and only retroactively claiming support for the Tullys. Now in the book, Walder Frey is actually mistaken. He thinks Tully calls him late because he's old and about to die. Now Walder Frey is not dumb, so for him to not consider his lateness to the Trident kind of implies that Walder Frey didn't think he did anything wrong. He was honestly late and planned on supporting Tully the whole time. If this is the case, this means that much of the Tully-Frey feud is based on a misunderstanding. Hoster Tully thought Frey didn't support him in war, and Walder Frey thought Hoster Tully was insulting him because of his old age and expecting him to die. Of course, there's also a matter of a marriage refusal, but I do wonder if the late insult had been avoided, if the Red Wedding would have never happened. Now here in the show, Walder Frey announces that he's Lord of Riverrun. In the book, Riverrun is actually given to Walder's son, Emmon Frey, who is married to Jenna Lannister, the sister of Tywin. Jenna really rules over Emmon, so Riverrun isn't really a gift to the Freys, it's a gift from the Lannisters to the Lannisters. Anyway, Roose Bolton mentions that the Blackfish escaped. Again, in the book, the Blackfish was not at the Red Wedding. Roose also mentions that Robb didn't follow any of his advice, and that was the reason for his betrayal. In the book, Roose is actually not with Robb for most of the campaign. We aren't quite sure when exactly Roose chose to switch sides. It's clear that Roose was keeping his options open from the beginning and was preserving his own forces, but when he switched sides is up for debate. There is an interesting moment at Harrenhal when Roose reads a book and then places it in a fire. His switch may have been influenced by the contents of that book, whatever it was. Next we get an extra scene where Ramsay is taunting Theon about cutting off his penis. In the book, Theon's penis is probably cut off, but it's only sort of mentioned in an offhand remark by someone else. Theon never thinks about it, and the fact that Theon never thinks about it really highlights an important aspect of George R. Martin's writing style. Just because a character doesn't think about something or observe it in print doesn't mean it isn't there. For example, some fans think that Cersei accidentally poisoned Joffrey. The counter to this theory is usually, wouldn't she think about that? The answer is no, not necessarily. Next, Bran's entourage is awoken by Sam and Gilly. In the book, Sam is ensnared in Mira's net, but in both book and show, Sam quickly determines that this is Bran and there's no threat. Now in the book, Sam is told by Cold Hands that the one he seeks is inside. So Sam, without too much questioning or protest, accepts that Bran is going north of the wall and agrees to keep his meeting with Bran a secret. Here in the show, a little more motivation is given to everyone. Jojen tells Sam that he knows about the White Walkers and the Army of the Dead and must go north to stop them. Next we get an extra scene where Balon and Yara receive Theon's penis in the mail, and we get a completely different plot where Yara decides to pick 50 of her best killers and sail around the continent to the Dreadfort to save Theon. In the book, Balon is dead, and Asha resides at Deepwood Motte, briefly returning to the Iron Isles for the Kingsmoot before returning to Deepwood Motte. She never attempts any rescue of Theon, likely because Theon has a better claim to the Iron Isles than she does. Next we get an extra scene where Sam gives some obsidian to Bran and tells them that it kills White Walkers. The gang then heads out the secret gate. Now, as I said before, in the book the secret gate is called the Black Gate, and it only opens if a man of the Night's Watch recites his vows in front of it. Sam does so, and the gate's weirwood face opens its mouth and Bran's gang walks through. Notably, water drips down on Bran and is salt water. This of course adds to the mystery of the wall. The wall oddly keeps its shape and actually seems to regenerate. Why hasn't it fallen apart or sublimated? Whether the answer be magic or technology, it seems seawater is pumped in as a material. Next we get an extra scene where Davos and Gendry connect over being raised in Flea Bottom. Here Gendry highlights the contradiction of warring to create a better world for your children when war itself kills children. The discussion seems to inspire Davos to save Gendry. In the book, Davos' plan to save Edric Storm is a long planned out conspiracy. And then we get an extra scene between Varys and Shae where he attempts to bribe Shae to leave Westeros because she is a distraction for Tyrion. As I've talked about repeatedly, in the book, there is quite a bit of evidence that Shae is Varys' creature, a mechanism used to manipulate Tyrion. And then we get an extra scene of Tyrion drinking with Pod that's interrupted by Cersei. Cersei and Tyrion then talk about happiness, children, and the endlessness of war. In the book, the two never are this sentimental with each other. And then we get another extra scene where Arya and the Hound pass some men who are at the Red Wedding, and Arya is allowed to go revenge kill them. She does use an element from the book where she drops a coin and then stabs a man. This is something she used during her Harrenhal escape. And yet another extra scene where Ygritte catches up with Jon and they talk about how they love each other, and then Ygritte shoots Jon with an arrow. In the book, Jon is shot with his arrow as he escapes Queen's Crown Tower, feeling lucky that the arrow hit him instead of his horse. He thinks and dreams of Ygritte and compares his dutiful return to the Watch to his father's dutiful return to Catelyn. An extra scene? Yes, it is. It's between Sam and Aemon talking about Gilly staying at the Wall because it's dangerous north of there. In the book, Sam and Gilly don't make it back to Castle Black until after Stannis arrives. Gilly proves herself useful to the Wall as a wet nurse for Mance's child, and thus is allowed to stay. Now here Maester Aemon sends out ravens to the Lords of Westeros begging for help. In the book, this plea is sent out a bit earlier, back when the Night's Watch was at the Fist of the First Men. Sam had sent back to Castle Black ravens on the Wildling invasion, but he forgot to add messages to his ravens during the attack of the Whites. This actually changes things quite a bit from book to show with regard to Davos and Stannis' motivation. You see, in the book, Davos finds a letter from the Night's Watch warning of the coming Wildling invasion, but at the same time, Davos talks with the Maester about how men are men. Davos sympathizes with the Wildling position. So one would think that the motivation for sailing north would be either defending the Night's Watch from the Wildlings or using the Wildlings as an army. However, when Stannis and Melisandre arrive at the Wall, they speak about the Great Other north of it. This is a very interesting disconnect. Stannis did look into Melisandre's flames and see shapes at the Fist of the First Men, but that's a huge jump to associate it with the Wildling invasion. In the book, one really has to question how much Stannis is bullshitting and scheming as he goes along. Did he arrive at the Wall to save the Night's Watch and use the Wildlings, and then become interested in the others? Or is he simply feigning interest in the others to impress Jon Snow and use the resources of the Night's Watch while he recruits the Wildlings? Although Stannis claims to be interested in what's north of the Wall, all of his actions seem concerned with what's going on south of the Wall. Anyway, here in the show we have a scene where Stannis finds out Robb Stark is dead and wants to sacrifice Gendry. Considering 3 leeches were burned, this isn't actually very impressive. In the book, both Robb Stark and Balon Greyjoy die, and Davos convinces Stannis to wait for the Third King. When Joffrey finally dies, then Davos takes action with Edric Storm. Anyway, here in the show, Davos takes action to save Gendry and puts him in a rowboat to escape. In the book, Davos has a conspiracy of men made up of non-R'hllor-worshipping Stannis supporters who spirit Edric Storm away to Lyce. Next we have Jon returning to the Wall. In the book, Sam is not present for his return, and the return is a bit bittersweet for Jon. He discovers at this point that Bran and Rickon are dead, and that Theon is being flayed. He does wonder if Bran is living a second life inside Summer. And then we get a scene of Jaime's return. In the book, Jaime does not return to King's Landing until after Joffrey's wedding and his death. In fact, his first meeting with Cersei is when he finds her in the Sept with Joffrey's body, and the two have sex there. And then we have a scene where Stannis wants to sacrifice Gendry, and is furious that Davos has let him go, and Davos uses the letter from the Night's Watch as his shield. The book is similar in that Davos does the same thing with Edric's Storm. However, as I mentioned before, there is a disconnect between why Davos wants to go north and why, say, Jon would want them to be there. In the book, the scene ends with the presentation of the letter, a letter that warns of a wildling invasion, and not an army of the dead. We are left wondering what exactly Stannis, Davos, and Melisandre talked about. And finally, we have a scene with Dany where she is waiting for the slaves to be freed from Yunkai. Again in the book, Dany never conquers Yunkai and simply demands their freedom. Here in the show, Dany has conquered the city, so she's waiting for whether or not the slaves want to leave their enslavement. Of course, shocker, slaves prefer not to be enslaved. Now in the book, Dany had a vision at the House of the Undying where she rode between people screaming mother. And so she helps this vision along by choosing to ride between the slaves while they yell this. However, there are a couple other times later where people yell mother at her while Dany rides between them, namely when diseased people are dying outside of the walls of Meereen, and when she rides away on her dragon in the fighting pits. So it's uncertain which event this vision refers to, or whether Dany is just creating the events around the vision to try to fulfill them. And that's it for episode 3.10. See you in episode 4.1.